您第一次来景德镇的大概是在什么时候？而且在你第一次来景德镇之前，你脑子里面所想象的景德镇是一个什么样子的？
Okay, so I've been to Jingdezhen 7 times. This is my 7th time, and I came first in 2010. And before I came, I imagined Jingdezhen in the 16th and 17th century. So I was imagining I was going to find a city with old buildings like this beautiful building. So I was surprised to see a very kind of modern city, but I really liked it. I think the place is beautiful, surrounded by hills and pine trees and a lot of green. So I fell in love with Jingdezhen actually when I came.
10多年时间，对景德镇城市变化感受最深的是什么？
I'm very pleased to see that Jingdezhen is a very clean city nowadays, and they are doing a lot of preservation work. So I'm very pleased to see how Jingdezhen is growing and respecting its past.
您看，您的主要研究方向是16到18世纪的中国外销史，这300年期间，那么景德镇是中国陶瓷的一个重要的代表，对东西方的商业与文化的交流起到了很重要的这个推动作用。你像我们在广东台山的西南方向有个岛，出土了大量的这个明代的景德镇民谣的瓷器碎片。那么研究表明呢，上川岛是葡萄牙人在占领澳门之前，就是在中国沿海地区的一个非常重要的走私贸易点。那么因为葡萄牙人可能也是最早来中国直接从事这个陶瓷贸易的一个欧洲商人。那么而且在这个时候还出现了这个带有葡萄牙王室徽章的瓷器，能不能给我们描述一下当时这种早期的情况？
So the Portuguese were the first Europeans who came to trade in Asia. So they discovered Africa first, and then they went to India. And from the moment they went to India, Chinese porcelain began to arrive to Europe, to the Lisbon court for the king and the queen. But initially it was small quantities, so the first few decades. Exactly the first trade occurred in San Juan Island that we have documentation of. So it is said, according to the documents, that the Portuguese installed some tents and storehouses, so they would accumulate a few quantities of porcelain and then they would take them to Europe via their maritime trade, which they would come from San Juan, go to India, and from India stop by in Mozambique Island, which had become the Portuguese capital of East Africa, and then they would go to Europe. So that is the first Portuguese trade. Then in 1557, they established themselves in Macau, and from the moment greater quantities of porcelain began to arrive. And the shipwreck Espadarte, which sank in 1558, 1 year after the Portuguese established themselves in Macau, gives testimony of the quantity and variety of porcelains, particularly from Jingdezhen, were imported into Portugal. Then in the late 16th century, from 1573 onwards, the Spanish, they established themselves in Manila, and from there they exported huge quantities of porcelain to the Americas, to what is today Mexico, and Peru, but particularly to Mexico, to the port of Acapulco. And from there, a large quantity of that porcelain was put in a mule train, so mules were carrying inland to Mexico City, the capital, and then another quantity was put in with mules going to Veracruz, the port that was used to traverse the Atlantic from the Americas to Spain. So the largest quantity went to Mexico City and a small quantity went to Veracruz to Spain. So this is very important, this trade, because one of the first ships that went from Manila carried 22,300 pieces. That is a huge number of pieces of porcelain. The cargoes of the shipwrecks we have found in this route, the Trans-Pacific trade route as we call it, the majority is from Jingdezhen, the majority is blue and white, but it also included some porcelains decorated in overglazed enamels and some Kinrande porcelains with overglazed enamels and gilding. And the quality of the porcelains varied from the very best to sort of not so good.
17世纪以后，各国东印度公司的相继成立，它为景德镇瓷器遍行天下起到一个积极的一个推动作用。以荷兰东印度公司为例，他说他们是如何在这个巴德维亚和这个台湾建立据点，然后把中国瓷器销往世界各地的这样一个怎样的这个运行模式，你来跟我们介绍一下。
So just to make a point before we go into the Dutch, the first time that Chinese porcelain, in this case mostly Jingdezhen porcelain, was traded all over the world was by the Spanish, who traded cracked porcelain, because it went from Manila. So it started in China with Chinese junks going to Manila, from Manila to Acapulco, from Acapulco to Veracruz, and from Veracruz to Spain. So cracked porcelain is the first Jingdezhen porcelain exported all over the world. This is before the Dutch began to trade. Then the Dutch established the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, in 1602. And from that moment on, they brought millions of pieces. So the scale of the trade grew enormously in the beginning of the 17th century. And the Dutch established themselves in Batavia, and from Batavia they had permission to pillage Spanish and Portuguese ships. So they would take the cargo of Portuguese ships, like Santa Catarina. They took the ship back to Amsterdam and they sold their contents. And that began a craze for porcelain in the Netherlands. So initially, all these pieces were obviously belonging to the VOC members or participants, and then they sold all over Europe these porcelains, initially only for the aristocracy and bourgeoisie, but then also for the middle classes, and even the lower classes had access to a small quantity of pieces. So the VOC is very important because we have the VOC documents detailing very clearly which types of porcelain and the quantities of porcelain that were being exported. That is very important because the Portuguese and the Spanish were not very detailed when explaining or listing the pieces that were put on board of the ships to be transported. So the VOC documents serve a lot for research, and you can identify certain types of pieces through these documents.
在欧洲是很著名的研究中国外销瓷的专家。那您在这些年里面，先后出了3部著作。那么，其中我们今天带来了一部，是叫《景德镇 to the World: The Lurid Collection of Chinese Export Porcelain from the Late Ming Dynasty》。我是第一次看到这本书，但是我们对它的内容应该是非常有兴趣。尤其是他起的这个标题 景德镇走向世界，跟我们分享一下他这本书里面一些主要内容和主要观点。
This book includes about 160 something pieces in this collection created by Tom and Nancy Lurie, who live in Columbus, Ohio. Has a number of unique pieces or very extremely rare pieces that demonstrate that in the case of cracked porcelain was produced in very, very high quality as well as in medium and lower quality. But the quality of some of these pieces is truly extraordinary. And this quality was possible because the imperial kilns were closed in 1608, or ceased production in 1608, and the best porcelain potters and painters went to work in the private kilns, which were producing porcelain for the export market. So these pieces are not only fantastically well potted and thinly potted, but they're also painted brilliantly with a very bright underglaze blue and with very, very fine quality painting. So the book is called Jingdezhen to the World because it demonstrates that the types of porcelain discussed in the book, which are cracked porcelain, transitional porcelain, mainly high transitional porcelain produced for the European market, particularly the Dutch market. Then it has some kosometsuke pieces produced for the Japanese market in the Tianqi and Chunren reign, and has some pieces from the Hatcherrek, which sank in circa 1643, so at the very end of the Ming dynasty. And these pieces demonstrate, with the archaeological finds that I studied from different parts, a trip here to Jingdezhen to study the shards excavated, thanks to Professor Zhao Jianwen, to Huan Wei, and to Huang Qinghua, who let me photograph the shards. I was able to demonstrate that all these type of porcelains were exported all over the world, and that is the title of the book.
那么也就是说，这个瓷器、文献档案、出土的窑址，这三个点都能够对应起来。
It combines archaeology from all over the world, plus textual sources from different documents from different periods, and Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch documents, and then it also includes a number of paintings that demonstrate that pieces similar to the ones in the Lurie collection were brought into Europe.
这个在荷兰呢有很多的这个油画，里面就有瓷器，而且以青花瓷器还是比较多的。
Yes, initially in the 16th and 17th century, you see mostly blue and white. But in the 18th century, some pieces decorated in overglazed enamels were also portrayed.
这本书的一个创作过程，是吧？从景德镇方面的一些专家对提供了一些帮助。对于中国的外销史，尤其16到18世纪，它往欧洲的瓷器，当年的出口的量很大。到今天为止，还有大量的当年的瓷器还留在欧洲。那么这些东印的公司或者其他贸易机构，它也有一个相对比较完整的一些历史资料，也留在那里的，就是器物和文献都还在。那么它的这些瓷器的生产地，比如在景德镇，生产这些瓷器的窑址，在陆陆续续在发现。那么这样一个过程当中，中国的学者和欧洲的学者怎么样加强合作，进一步研究这个外销瓷的问题，然后进一步来解释景德镇瓷器为什么当年能够称霸天下。
So I would first of all try to document very well what is excavated. Wainge kiln site now is being excavated. So it's very important to document, to take photographs, measurements, and maybe even samples of the porcelain itself, of the underglazed cobalt blue and the glaze, to understand very well the production size of the porcelain. And then I would personally invite scholars from the Netherlands, like for example from the Rijksmuseum, specialists who know very well the Dutch trade in different periods. And then I would invite also scholars from Japan who will understand where porcelain from Jingdezhen has been excavated in Japan. So you have the combination of archaeology in China and archaeology in Japan. So to learn about the uses, for example, who used Chinese porcelain made for the Japanese domestic market. And I will also invite people from England so they understand the English trade. And then I would invite them to do research, and then I would invite them to publish together with the Chinese scholars here who are studying the subject. And so then you have the best of archaeological sites with the textual sources and both an understanding between Asia and the West.
欢迎阁遗址当年就生产外销史。
Yes, yes. One of them. We know about 16 already.